exactly. So what I'm going to do is walk you through sort of a year in seed. What I like to do is start in the winter. I feel like the appropriate beginning of any agricultural season is sort of that winter time. You can sort of envision it being ourselves being that seed under the ground, sort of gestating, sort of thinking about what our season's going to be like. It's sort of that dark time. It's that time where we all obsessively get out the seed catalogs and sort of have this like really idealistic view of what our season's going to be like, and then come, August or September, we quickly realize what a mistake of how many things we put on our plate and how realistic that really is. So, and this is something that I work a lot with my growers. Again, as Michaela mentioned, I work with a collective of around 12 farmers. We're actually bringing on 4 new farms this year to increase up to 16. And so I serve as part of that cooperative as kind of a extension agent, so to speak, helping hold their hand, helping them to learn how to integrate seed stewardship into an already diversified market farm. I think it's a really important piece to really sort of get an edge in. And so I'll sort of walk you through this. And again, this will be recorded. If you guys have any other questions or want this PowerPoint for future reference, just shoot me an email, and I can let that. So this is some carrot seed that we grow on our farm in California, a beautiful umbel, and we'll talk a little bit about biennials. So I'm going to talk about winter twice. We're going to start in the winter, and then we're going to end up in winter again. But in the beginning, we're talking about how we plan for this, because it's really important to be thinking ahead. I know Jared kind of already talked about some of these considerations, but really thinking about how spacing is very different from food production. A lot of the growers that I work with see things from a very sort of veggie-centric, sort of produce-centric viewpoint, and I really have to get them thinking about how different the spacing is. But what I like to encourage in this thinking is stacking functions and creativity, how we can, many of my produce growers are very good at utilizing their space down to very tight margins, and many of my growers utilize the roguing and the selection as part of their harvesting plans. So when they're working with biennials or fresh lettuce, they plant thicker than what they'd need for seed production and then thin down. But you just have to remember to tell those produce growers to not select all the big, beautiful heads for market, that those are going to be the ones for seed. Another really, I know that Jared talked about this timing, so I won't really dive into that too much. But what I really want to emphasize is knowing which seed crops historically do well in your bioregion. We've learned the hard way. We've learned, by a lot of trial and error and mistakes of which seed crops do not do well in our Sierra foothills climate. We're really not set up for brassica seed production, for example, like I gave that example. And so we're learning how to really focus on our farm of which ones, things like very hot season eggplants, peppers, melons, things like that do really well, give us really, high productivity, a lot of bang for our buck when we do our enterprise budgeting and seeing, how much, productivity we can get off a small piece of land. And with our market farmers who are integrating seed production into their farm, this is a really important piece. So we rely more heavily in the last few years on sort of interregional trade. So we're linking up with Andrew or some folks up in the Pacific Northwest to produce some seed that may not historically or agronomically produce seed very well in our region. And so this is where talking to farmers in your region who do produce seed is helpful. It's also, I will continue to sort of emphasize and encourage you to take really good records as you begin your seed stewardship journey, so that you can begin to identify which of those crops do really well for you in your specific area. And then again, continuing to use good rotation practices to ensure good plant health. A lot of the times when we're growing for seed, we're having some of those plants stay in the ground much longer, which can be sort of a breeding ground for a lot of pests and diseases. And so you really want to ensure that you're following good rotation practices. And I'll also talk about good weed management and maintenance, because that's a pretty key piece with growing a good seed crop. So in choosing the right crop, our fellow Justin here isn't in here right now, but And as a part of our seed cooperative, any new grower that comes on, we only assign them a self-pollinated crop. So that basically, initially right off the bat, eliminates any issues around cross-contamination. So it really gives them that opportunity to have a really good success from seed to seed on their farm without having to worry about GMO contamination, varietal purity issues. So these are things like lettuces, beans, tomatoes and peppers, even though they're slightly promiscuous, are still also really good sort of entry-level seed crops that ensure good success without having to worry. As the director of the seed cooperative, it kind of comes to me to set up the quality assurance program for the seeds that we're buying in. And so that makes me feel really good to know that this new grower who's juggling, his market farm and his CSA has a really easy entry-level crop to work with. You also want to choose your appropriate scale. If you're starting off with a new seed stewardship project, and this is something that you've never done before, you don't necessarily want to go out and plant, a quarter acre to lettuce seed when you've never seen lettuce all the way through. Starting out with just a couple hundred row feet or bed feet to sort of, get your toes in the water, so to speak, is a really great way. And so you're just going to have to sort of figure that out for yourself. Again, another problem with some of the growers that I've pulled on into our cooperative is that they get so excited right off the bat. They come to one of these workshops and they get bit by the seed-saving bug. And then they show up to the meeting and they're like, I'm going to grow 20 crops, seed crops, and I'm going to grow, this or that. And so I always, say, slow down, just, start with 1 or 2 crops and seed all the way through. And then also make sure that and we'll talk about this later in the economics piece, is that make sure you have somewhere where that seed's going. Because it's really easy to produce a ridiculous amount of seed in a small area. And then I have growers who are like, yeah, I have 50 pounds of beet seed. And I'm like, well, I can buy in like 10 or 15 of that. And then now they have 30 or 40 pounds of beet seed that they're selling on spec to companies who may not want to buy that seed. And so, so really just thinking about your expected yield from those seed crops and thinking really well about that. Unfortunately, in a lot of the seed-saving manuals, we have seed to seed. We have John Navasio's wonderful organic seed grower book. We have a new book coming out through OSA and collaboration between OSA and Seed Savers called The Seed Garden. We have many references that help you guide you through a seed crop all the way through. But because each variety is different, it's hard to know. Like a lot of my growers have the question, well, if I'm going to grow 10 pounds of lettuce seed for you, how much lettuce plants do I start with? And for every, the sort of answer to that is like, well, it depends. Because as, Frank, every lettuce variety is different in terms of how much productivity, how much seed yield. And so, what I'm hoping as we move forward with this organic seed movement is that many of us who are producing seed are taking really good records and
Don't look at me.
and putting it down into some collective database so that we can understand and have informed actions when we're doing this winter planning to know how much plants we need to put in the field to get X amount of yield. And so that's sort of a pie in the sky kind of exciting thing that I hope I get to see in my lifetime. Like, really the only reference that I can point people in the direction of is there's like a couple of pages in Knott's Vegetable Handbook that talks about seed yield, and I've torn that thing apart. Yeah, it's just frustrating,
I'll just say that, I've looked at Knott carefully, and first of all, the yields that they give, they've interviewed those that yield data that's in Knott's, take it with a pillar of salt, because they will have interviewed a few professional seed growers that, for me, I think generally it's on the high side, considerably on the high side. John may agree with me on that. So whenever I'm doing averages, I'll take the low end, and even that kind of seems a little high. So you have to find it. You have to do it yourself and find it from variety to variety. And I just want to say that choosing the right crop is so key to this whole thing, because You know, Andrew and I had a discussion last night about, you know, because he's so stubborn, and he's going to grow broccoli, and, you know, to hell with everything else. He's going to grow broccoli, and that's great, and I'm glad that he's doing it. But I'm in a place in California where I can probably outproduce him. You know, I'm not trying to brag. It's just that it's true in that particular case. So it may be a thing where we might want to trade things, because I know he grows stuff he can do a lot better than me. So you have to really, first of all, as Rowen said, start small and really get your yield information down, or pretty well, and do it a couple of times.
Yeah, and keep good records, and I'll give you guys some good resources to do that. So if you
just want a rule of thumb, just assume you're going to get an ounce of seed per plant, and start with that.
Sounds good. We always like rules of thumb. Great. Well, I'm going to call on Frank here in just a moment. What we want to talk about a little bit is about sourcing our seed in this word called provenance, which is sort of your seed is only as good as your seed crop is only going to be as good as the seed that you start with, right? And so we really want to be focusing on good stock seed. So I don't know, Frank, I know you've talked extensively about this and are kind of some of our go-to stock seed person. So if you want to talk a little bit about developing stock seed for your own seed crops.
Okay, so as Jared mentioned, all the rules for saving commercial your seed for your own use or for commercial purposes are the same rules as you use for stock seed, except for stock seed, it's much more rigorous. If you were planning to, on a commercial basis, allow a mile between you and another spinach farm to produce your spinach crop for your commercial seed, you might want to allow 2 miles between yourself and a commercial lettuce spinach field for your stock seed, if you can. If you're, you might save twice as many plants as would normally be recommended as a minimum on the population size. You're going to be roguing very, very carefully for the idiotype that you want. In your commercial seed, you may look at it and you say, yeah, that's semi-Savoyed, sure. But then if you're actually keeping the seed for a spinach that's supposed to be semi-Savoyed, that's what it needs to be. It's not going to get any better. So for your stock seed, that's what you're going to get. And so your rigor has to be very high in terms of what you save. What's your name? I haven't seen your moment. Andrew talked about the dangers of going down to 20 plants, for saving seed, and how if you're going down to 20 plants to save your lettuce seed, every one of those plants better be right on. Otherwise, you're going to have 5% off types just right off the bat. And so that's called genetic drift, by the way. It's when the traits change in your population, usually because either you didn't select properly, or your population size was small and there was an off type in there that you didn't really recognize as an off type, and then the next generation looks a little different and you're going, is that what I started out with? I don't know. Anyway, this has happened to me with lettuce when I've saved only a small number of, well, when I say small, when I say 20 lettuce plants from something I'm developing, and then the next generation I look at it and I see more variability than I thought was supposed to be there, that's probably because in one of those 20 or 2 of those 20 weren't really right on. So it's happened to me. One of the most important things about stock seed, though, is that you can't have any seed-borne diseases in it. This is huge. And I think that you're pointing to me on this so that I can talk about disease management in stock seed. Well, in lettuce, if you have viruses in your stock seed, you're sure going to have viruses in your commercial seed. So your lettuce stock seed, you know, you've really got to try very, very, very hard to make sure there are no lettuce mosaic virus hiding in there. In brassicas, there are plenty of seed-borne diseases, and I'm going to tell you a scary story about one right now. Ever since I became a member of the Willamette Valley Specialty Seed Association, there has been this shadow hanging out there that no one ever wanted to fall on the Willamette Valley. And we used fear of this thing to help keep canola out of the valley. This was one of our arguments. If you bring canola to the valley and start growing it on 1,000-acre scale, you're going to bring the shadow of seed death to the Willamette seed industry. And that seed shadow is the blackleg disease, FOMA. FOMA is a seed-borne disease, and once you get it in your region, it is very difficult to get it out of your region. It travels on the wind. It infects plants, brassica plants, generally during the winter season. So you go into winter with a perfect stand of plants. And by the time spring comes, you've got these little spots on your leaves that look really innocuous. To me, it just looks like, well, that's just spots on kale. What's the big deal? Eventually, the bottom of the plant gets these black lesions on it. The vascular tissue is destroyed. And the plant might produce a crop of seed for you, despite all that. And that would be the worst luck of all, because then you would pass that seed on to other people. And when that seed is sold to a, let's say, a kale grower or a radish grower, when they plant the infected seed, they get a seedling that comes up and dies. So if you're selling this commercially to your fellow organic farmers, you are assuring their crop failure. So this is why there are certain seed diseases, like blackleg, that scare the hell out of seed-growing regions. Last spring, I was visited by blackleg, along with about 200 other seed growers in the Willamette Valley. And it just showed up. And I got a call, I didn't know it. I got a call from a plant pathologist at ODA. She's someone I know. She said, I've been finding blackleg in commercial seed fields. We also found it in our test canola fields, which they're being allowed to grow. And boy, did things start flying. Right now, how many people here are from the Willamette Valley? How many of you know that we're under a brassica seed quarantine? I see 3 hands, and 2 of them are in the seed business. Are you in the seed business? Yeah, okay. So the people in the seed business know about it. The people growing cabbage and radishes to take to Saturday market, they don't seem to know about it. Even though it's been in the Capitol Press, there's been a notification sent out by ODA that this is in effect. But right now, we're under a quarantine. Any brassica seed grown in the state of Oregon, not just the Willamette Valley, has to be certified blackleg free, or you can't plant it. And I'm talking about you as a cabbage or a radish grower. If you're planting radish seed right now that doesn't have a certificate showing it's blackleg free, you're in violation of this rule. Anybody know that? I bet there's a lot of people in violation of this rule here right now. Okay, So if you're a seed company selling into the state of Oregon right now, you're not allowed to sell any brassica seed here in quantities larger than a half-ounce packet. You can't sell an ounce of F1 Bayho cabbage from Europe here. How many people have bought an ounce of Bayho cabbage from Europe recently? Nobody's going to admit it. Okay, so back up. Unless it has been tested for FOMA and treated with either a fungicide, which doesn't work for organics, or with hot water treatment. And I'm going to describe hot water treatment in a minute. Because now, as a seed company with a whole lot of brassicas in my list, growing them all in the Willamette Valley, I can't sell that seed without testing every batch. There's $50 for that. But while you're doing it, you should be testing for another seed-borne disease called xanthomonas, and that's $150. So there's $200 to test all my brassica seed.
That's right, xanthomonas is black rot.
It's black rot. Don't be confused by this. Black leg and black rot. Black leg is FOMA. Black rot is xanthomonas. Xanthomonas is bacterial. Black leg is fungal. But the point is, if you and black rot has put a lot of cabbage growers out of business in Ohio and the whole East Coast. Historically it's one of the diseases that wipes out cabbage growers is black rot. That's right. And the Skagit is also under quarantine for seed from Oregon for FOMA. So I can't sell any seed in the northwest corner of Washington State unless it's tested and treated. This is how the rule came down. And the logic of this, I'm not going to try to explain. You have to test it, and even if you get a negative on your test, you still have to treat it. The downside of this is if you hot water treat your organic seed, you have just reduced the shelf life of that seed to 6 months. There's a real problem here, folks. So anyway, we're all going to be making our way through this, but there's no reason to believe that this problem is going to go away anytime soon. This is a huge issue, so we're taking a side trip on this.
So Incotech has a new technology. They have one big machine down in California that is doing a very similar treatment, and it's less detrimental to the seed. So there is some development. They've been doing it on spinach, and they've been doing it on endive, and I believe carrot. So there is some movement happening that there will be another option for organics to do some cleaning of seed.
What is it?
It's the, Adrian, you remember what it was called? I think it's like the thermoseed. Yeah.
Say it again?
Thermoseed.
They're just heating it up. Hot air treatment?
It's not as aggressive as typical hot water.
But it
treatment.
is heat.
Yes.
Okay.
But the rule says you have to heat it in water.
Yeah. just to get back to the rule, there's only one approved treatment other than fungicide in the state of Oregon, and that's hot water treatment.
And they did that just to be nice to us.
That's right. No, actually, as it turns out, hot water treatment, I'm told by the pathologist, is more effective than fungicides.
And what are the options, Frank, for somebody if they want to get it hot water treated, other than doing it yourself? Is there...
So the question was, is there someone who will commercially hot water treat your seed? I'm sure there is. I haven't looked into it because I've got so many lots, and some of the lots are really small, and I've just decided that we're going to... Basically, I'm setting up a new seed shop right now, and I'm going to have a whole section of it devoted to hot water treatment just because of this, because I don't expect this disease to go away. I think it's going to get worse, actually, because, as it turned out, even though the seed growing industry was informed about all this during the growing season last year, And we were all told what we were supposed to do in terms of treating the fields, and what we were supposed to do was we were supposed to incorporate all of our debris deeply. Because if you want to get rid, the FOMA stays in the stalk of the plant. It's not just in the seed. It's in all the woody parts of the plant. And any of those woody parts of the plant that are laying on the surface are releasing spores. And as long as that woody plant is there, and these things can live for 5 years, if you've ever noticed, as long as that woody debris is in the field, anytime it comes to the surface, it can be releasing ascospores that are spreading miles downwind. So everyone was supposed to deep plow their fields to control this. No seed grower wants to deep plow their field, because if you do that, you just buried your seed. That is, all the scattered seed from the harvest is laying on the surface. The normal practice in a seed growing region is to let that be on the surface, let it sprout out before you, in the fall rain, before you incorporate that into the field. Otherwise, your brassica seed will just keep coming back year after year, and you will have volunteers in your field that are not only cross-pollinating things they're not supposed to be cross-pollinating, they could very well be infected with blackleg and start the cycle all over again. So there's this tension. And I was told by the pathologist last week, she saw many, many fields in which the debris was not incorporated. We have had ideal conditions for the spread of spores over the last 2 months, and she is expecting this spring to be worse than last year. So, just telling you. So what we had to do, okay, so let's talk for a second about what happens when you get a seed-borne disease like this in your field. I'll tell you what we did. This was in a mustard crop of ours. We hand harvested the field. If you were combining it, you'd be dead. You couldn't do this. We hand harvested it, and we only cut the tops of the plants. And we did not cut plants where the disease had spread into the upper canopy. We left those. So we did a very conscious plant-by-plant seed harvest of this field. We pulled it off. We had it tested. And much to my surprise and the surprise of the pathologist, we got clean seed out of this field. I don't know how that was possible. The pathologist's response was, is Lindsay here?
She's actually collecting samples in Fort Corvallis today.
Okay. Lindsay DeToy was supposed to be here, and I was hoping she would comment about this issue. But Lindsay saw my field. She consulted with me about what to do. And I got to tell her, Lindsay, there's no disease in my seed. I wanted an explanation. And all she said was, aren't you glad of that? That's very fortunate. So anyway, it doesn't matter. I have to heat treat that seed anyway. So I'm now in the position of heat treating thousands of pounds of seed in order to be able to sell it. Yes? Question?
Why pay the money to have it tested if you have to heat treat it anyway?
That was my question to the ODA. And they said, because, this is why, because they're now saying if it has blackleg in the seed on the test, then treating it is not good enough. You have to throw it away. So it's a 2-level prophylactic. First level is you got to test it. If it shows negative, okay, you can still sell it, but you got to treat it first. If it shows positive, you can't save it by treating it, even though treating it will save it. So I see Navazio looking at me like, holy crapazola. And
well, that's why there's no kale seed right now.
Well, that's why there's no kale seed from the Willamette Valley anyway. Okay, so how do you heat treat the seed? It's pretty straightforward. You put the seed in hot water, 50 degrees centigrade, that's 122 degrees. And you keep it in that 122 degree water for 25 to 30 minutes. The larger the diameter of the seed, the longer it stays in. So if you have small mustard seed, 25 minutes. If you have big kale seed, 30 minutes. The timing is critical. If you overdo it, you'll kill it for sure. If you underdo it, you won't be effective. What they would really like to have us do is test it, treat it, and test it again. That's what they would like to do, and I just said, I'd just throw that stuff away. But so this is why it's so important. If you save some stock seed with a seed-borne disease in it, it's not, you know, it might not wipe out your crop. You might be able to sell it. Well, guess what? Whoever buys it from you is now in a bad situation. And I know I have met farmers, and I won't say who they are, who lost the farm and changed businesses because of seed-borne disease. So this is a huge responsibility. It's the thing that keeps me up at night if I'm going to stay up, because it's an issue.
So we'll take one question and then we'll keep moving forward. So the question is there a good resource or publication to find out more about seed-borne diseases?
There are whole books on it. The Canadian book on vegetable diseases, what's it called, John?
I can't remember.
Anyway, the Canadians did an excellent book on diseases, which is available. You can find it online.
Jared, does OSA have a? So look at the back of the organic seed grower.
Yeah, that's good.
And then eOrganic has a bunch of resources for seed production, but one of them's discussing seed-borne diseases and seed treatment, hot water treatment, and covers, Frank was talking about it for, those range of temperatures for brassicas, but then there's different temperatures and times for other seed crops, and some things that hot water treatment isn't as appropriate for even.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Frank, for that in-depth information. I think we kind of took a little side shoot, but I think it's important to get that information out there. And I think it also, for me, it sort of emphasizes the importance of cooperation and collaboration in this work that we're doing, that, we see a lot of people, these independent seed companies popping up and, various people wanting to jump onto the organic seed movement. And I think working together, under a cooperative structure or a retail seed company so you can, get these seed tests done without each individual seed producer having to do that work, I think is important. And it shows great responsibility for the work that we're doing as seed keepers, because we are putting all of this material out there for farmers and gardeners.
Cindy had a question.
All right, I'm going to keep moving on that one. I'm not going to let the fears get the best of us here, folks. I'm going to keep moving. So now that we're talking about, we've started with good stock seed, hopefully if you're growing on contract, and we'll talk about ways you can integrate that into your seed production, that the retail seed company that you're growing for is giving you well-maintained stock seed to start with. Unfortunately, it's not the case with every seed contract that you sign on to, so you would want to make sure that you have a really great relationship with that seed company, and making sure that the seed that they're giving you is true to type, is vigorous, resilient, etc., before you sign on, because that can really have greater implications down the road for your in the year for that seed contract. Another way to determine good provenance, good stock seed, is to conduct variety trials, and so OSA has quite a number of resources. I'll reference them in a minute. What I did want to do, just talk briefly about, is talking about what kinds of seed we can start with. I know as a seed company representative, I get a lot of questions about what is OP versus hybrid, and what's heirloom. And so just to clarify, starting, if you are producing seed starting with open pollinated seed that is not PVP, that doesn't have a plant variety patent on it, if if you will be able to note that in a seed catalog, it should say PVP. You may have to do your research because I've noticed that there are some varieties that actually don't say that in a catalog. That PVP seed you can save for your own farm use, but you cannot save and sell it for commercial purposes. So an OP seed is basically a seed that has been produced, has been allowed to pollinate freely with the natural mechanisms such as wind, insects, birds, etc. Because there are no sort of restrictions with the flow of pollen, oftentimes the plants within populations or the populations themselves within open pollinated varieties are oftentimes more diverse than their hybrid counterparts. And open pollinated variety maintenance is based on selection of the offspring of the plants and doesn't really have so much to do with the parental lines like hybrid seed. And as long as the pollen is not shared between two varieties of the same species, then that seed should be grown true to type year after year. Heirloom seed is one of those funny, I get phone calls all the time. Are your seeds heirloom? It seems like heirloom in the mainstream has sort of become sort of the alternate to GMO in the minds of people. But really heirloom, all that heirloom denotes is that it has sort of a historical context. Seed Savers Exchange with our accession policy there, it really only has to be in circulation for 20 years. Is sort of the determination. And so many of the quote-unquote heirlooms that are in circulation are oftentimes vintage commercial varieties. They may have some sort of cultural memory or cultural traditions that are attached to them. They are open pollinated. They are genetically stable but not perfectly uniform. But I know that many of us in the seed realm sometimes, the word heirloom doesn't really hold a whole lot of water, and it's sort of one of those wiggly determinations. So what we're really looking for is starting with really good open pollinated seed, and heirloom is one of those categories. So hybrid seed, as denoted in a seed catalog, F1, is the crossing, intentional crossing between two highly inbred parents. So you can see here the pictures. You can see the two outside tomato plants are the parental lines, and then the middle is the F1 hybrid. So obviously within the commercial realm, we use heterosis or hybrid vigor as an advantage because obviously the offspring oftentimes is more productive and better producing than either of its inbred relatives. You can see here too on the bottom with the corn, you can see the two inbred lines, which on their own have a hard time standing, are not productive, but when we cross them together, we have hybrid vigor, and we have plants that are extremely uniform and produce well in an industrial organic situation. So, but again, if you can, we're not here to rag on hybrids. They do have their place within organic agriculture. But if you do want to begin the journey of seed stewardship, starting with an F1 hybrid is going to take you down a whole nother choose your own adventure, which could be 8 to 10 generations of stabilizing that particular variety. And so, yeah, not a great place to start if you're starting with seed stewardship. Justin?
I just wondered, could you explain why they're described as F1 or F2, what that term is?
Yeah, it's the word is filial 1, so it's it's in filial 2, filial 3. So it's basically denoting each generation as apart from the original first cross. So, you can have an F8 generation that might be, if you're attempting to stabilize a hybrid, as Frank, that was part of your Stocky Red Roaster adventure. Mm-hmm. How many filial generations did you have to go down to feel like you got?
Oh, I'm still going down. Stocky is probably 10 generations now, just guessing. But some of the others are only on generation 4 or 5. I mean, from the original cross, I just haven't done them.
Yeah.
So they're just sort of sitting.
Great.
Yeah.
So how many generations do you have to go down, or does it change constantly until it stabilizes, until it's open pollinated?
It depends. Like Frank is saying, he's gone down 10 generations and feel like there's relative stability. But again, for every crop type and for every variety, it's different. So generally, as a rule of thumb, we think 8 to 10.
This later.
Yeah. Yeah.
gonna talk
Okay,
about
great.
this.
He's gonna unpack that with greater detail. So you oftentimes see this hybrid technology in cabbage, broccoli, tomato, cucumber, squash, corn, and carrots. And then, we have genetically engineered seed. I'm not going to go into there, except for that, obviously, we know we don't want to start our seed stewardship journey with seed that is genetically modified. There's some great resources on the OSA website on setting up on-farm variety trials. I want to emphasize this because it's a very important step along your seed stewardship path, is determining which varieties do best in your specific bioregion. And so don't skimp on this part. If you think you're just going to, what we call is variety trying, which is sort of just throwing some seeds out in your field and taking a look at them, we'll give you some information, but doing a replicated trial as illuminated in some of these online resources is really, really advantageous and worth the while. As a seed cooperative, we do variety trials each and every year based on input from some of our CSAs and market farmers. So again, if you cooperate and collaborate with other seed growers in your region, you can be compiling really comprehensive data on which varieties do best in your specific area. Here is, again, another downloadable sheet from OSA that helps you to determine your trial goals and your whole setup for your variety trial. And this is also another great resource from OSA that is the variety trial evaluation form. And this will really help illuminate the evaluation. What I like to do is just use a 1 to 9 scale going out there. The important thing when you're setting up a variety trial is to actually find your 1 and find your 9 in the field. So not having sort of this idealistic view of what your perfect lettuce or your perfect broccoli is, but to actually identify in your field which one of those is a 9 and which one of those is a 1, which would be sort of the lowest performing, and then do your evaluations based on those benchmarks. Will really help, because sometimes our human mind tends to, John, you often talk about this, the ability to homogenize and sort of everything being a 4 or a 5, right? And then what good is your trial? It's sort of like, oh, it's all average, So you really just want to be discerning. Yeah. Great. So now we're heading into spring. We're thinking about considerations at sowing time and things that you want to be thinking about once you've picked your crop, once you've potentially set up your contract and figured out where that seed is going to go. We want to, again, figure out whether our crop is a selfer or a crosser. We want to make sure we set up a really robust population size. At the bottom here, I say always plant more than you need. As a rule of thumb for my growers, I always say plant at least a third more, 30% more than you think you'll need, because you want to be able to have that wiggle room for that tractor tire to run over a couple things, or to rogue out a few uglies along the way. So you always want to make sure you increase your size of what you're planting. When we're doing our stock seed selection, we're selecting from the time that we're sowing in trays all the way to the end, and so there's points along every part of the cultivation where you're engaging some selection pressure. And again, figuring out how much space each mature plant will need. Deciding your goal, I think this is really important, that's often overlooked, is understanding where you sit, what's your entry point, what's your goal for the seed. Is your seed for your own farm use? Will really change your approach versus if it's stock seed for a commercial seed company or even commercial seed. Again, the spectrum that Jared illuminated of isolation distances and all of that really play into your decision of where the seed is going to go. If you are just starting out on your seed stewardship journey, I would recommend trying a few seed crops just for your own farm use, just to get your feet wet, so to speak. And then you can kind of go maybe on that lower spectrum of isolation distances and population sizes. But as soon as you engage in a seed contract, or you have a small retail seed company, your considerations for quality are really going to change. And so you have seed for on-farm use. We have production seed for commercial scale. This could be, again, setting up a seed contract. It could be starting your own seed company and packaging that seed into small packets for retail sale. We'll go into that in greater depth in the economics. Foundation and stock seed, so this is quality selection and maintenance. This is oftentimes performed at the sort of retail or wholesale seed company level. But again, if you are really serious about seed stewardship, you will have your stash of stock seed that you'll want to go back to year in and year out. And so it really, it's really important to figure that out. But, you know, for instance, when I sign on for a commercial contract with Fedco or with you know, Southern Exposure or a sustainable seed company, they're paying me to just do a multiplication. So they're doing the work to produce the stock seed, which then they're giving me, and then I just grow it out and multiply it out and sell it back to them. And so, so that will change the way I approach it. They're not necessarily paying me to do extensive roguing and selection when I'm signing on for that commercial contract. Yeah. Great. And then there's plant breeding. I think plant breeding, will continue to talk about this throughout the day, that when you engage in seed stewardship, that you are a plant breeder by nature, and so wearing that hat proudly. So it's not necessarily something that's exclusive from these other things, but if you are doing a specific breeding project, you may not be producing enough to sell on a commercial scale initially. I will talk briefly just about irrigation in California. It's really sort of weighing heavily on my mind with the another year of impending drought. We exclusively use drip irrigation on our farm. I know that there are many farms in our region who have access to more irrigation district water who also use overhead watering. And so many of my growers, I'm having to continue to remind them about how to set up their irrigation systems so that they can grow for fresh market and also for seed. These, you know, in the drip irrigation world, these are my best friend. They're just a shut-off valve, so I can, because at a certain point in the seed life cycle, we are doing deficit irrigation and cutting water off to many beds on our farm, so we're not continuing to water and increase sort of like this disease and funguses that could potentially harm our seed crop. And so we are setting up our fields so that we can shut off entire sections of the field so that we're not overly watering them. You can see here is just a really sort of gross simplification of some of our field layouts, and you can see where the green triangles are places where we have either manual or electronic valve shutoffs, so I can you know, our main line irrigation that's going down to the field, I can shut off individual beds and not have it affect some of our other fresh market production. I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to pipe in about sort of how they work with irrigation and freshen. It's always great to hear.
Just one thing in general, because we're in Oregon and we had lots of water, I guess, we think. We always start ours off with overhead irrigation. It makes it easier to get the plants established in the field, we think. But basically, at some point, after the last weeding, cultivation between the rows, that's when you put down the drip tape. So we switch partway through the season. Start out overhead, and then after our last tractor trip through the field, we put down the drip.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, there's always a question about when to cut the water off.
Yeah, I'll talk about that in a minute, but
yeah, just one thing, and maybe, I don't know, you may have had the same problem, but I'm seeing an issue growing bush beans that, you know, seems like a pretty easy crop, but, you know, we cut the water off maybe a little early, and it looks like everything is ripe on there, and I did a little germ test of everything afterwards, and I was getting 98, 99%, and going, great, this is perfect. But then I sent it off to the Penn State lab, which they actually do a 400 seed count, and they really look at it, and it came back with 87% germ, and I had 12% abnormal. And I don't know if anybody else has had that problem, but I kind of think that it's because we shut the water off, and you've got these beans that look mature, but they in fact actually aren't quite mature. It's a lot easier to deal with it on indeterminate vining beans because you can just pick the bottom bottom ones, and you're assured of mature seed. But I don't know if anybody else has had issues around that with beans or any other crop where they may have prematurely cut the water off.
Yeah, great point. It's really, and it is sort of that dance that we do, and that, you know, finely tuned, deep observation and an intuition, I think, that is probably our greatest gift as seed keepers, is really keeping that intuitive sense and knowing that there's going to be times where you turn the water off a bit too soon, and, you know, your seed crop is, you know, greatly diminished in quality. Also in Oregon, you guys have to deal with this mystical thing called rain, which, you know, here in California, I'm like, what's that? You know, and you don't really have any, you know, you don't really have any control over that. And so, yeah, so it's really about being intuitive and being responsive and being, you know, deeply observational and in terms of jumping into action if needed. So we set up a pretty simple crop plan that is based around families. So we understand on our farm, we do things in sort of quadrants where we're, you know, growing the cucurbits in one region and, you know, the Fabaceae in another region, so we can ensure good crop rotation. Again, because I have, you know, interns and various people who work for me, we're always making sure over here that we're really keeping tabs on population size for our seed crops, so that we're always keeping that in mind as we move our way through the planting cycles. Knowing the isolation requirements of your crops. Again, there's many references for this. We don't necessarily have to keep all of this in our head. You know, my seed to seed is sort of like this jumbled up mess that lives in my farm truck, and it's been well loved and well used, and we can always make sure to reference this, but this is gonna really affect how you treat these crops in the field. As soon as the soil can be worked, and we'll talk a little bit more in a little bit about managing biennials, but you want to get those overwintered biennials in the ground as soon as the soil can be worked, so that you can get a good jump start on getting that re-veg happening, and so that they can get really settled into the earth before they initiate flowering. Back into the ground, yeah, exactly. Yeah, great. So I'll just talk briefly about a few ways that we can use isolation in our farm fields. Isolation by space is really advantageous and is the primary one that we use on our farm. We have 3 isolation fields separated by forest or distance. It just really makes things less complicated. For outcrossing species, again, you need to isolate, you know, from anywhere from 500 to well over a mile. So you need to figure that out for your own specific place and farm. This is another technique that I use quite often, especially in my corn grow-outs. I also use it in brassicas and Asian greens, is isolation by timing. So here's an example. In our cornfields, we in California can get 3 different corn crops to ripen in our long growing season. We plant a crop as soon as we can possibly work the soil. Sometimes, depending on the year, I may even, if it's just a stock seed selection, I may start it actually like under sort of a high tunnel or hoop. And then we will plant the second variety usually 3 to 4 weeks later. The first variety is already starting to initiate flowering. Then we plant this one. And so we're basically staggering flowering times. And then if you have a really short season variety, you can plant that third, while this one, 3 to 4 weeks later, and I've had great success with this. The one caveat to this that you want to keep in mind is that plants have this incredible ability to communicate to one another, and I've planted 2 corn crops side by side in the field. I think it was 3 weeks apart, and somehow the second corn communicated with the first corn and was like, "You better hurry up, you're late to the party." And it seriously, the flowering caught up to the first one, and I had a big cross pollination incident, which eventually ended up down a really fun breeding route. But for a commercial, it's a happy accident, you know. But I wouldn't recommend it. And so what I've done now for the future is always put some sort of insectary crop in between the 2 corn crops, so that you kind of just cut off that sort of pheromonal communication that happens, you know, on the farm. And you also, this is another place that I want to recommend, you know, whether it's corn or whether it's brassicas, Asian greens, really keeping great records in terms of from planting to silking time. Because for every different variety that you grow, it's going to be different. I steward and grow a lot of crops that are adapted to the southwest monsoon cycle, and those specific varieties have a very different reaction time to irrigation and to water, and so it can initiate a whole different sort of metabolic process that speeds up the planting to silking time based on that. And so just keeping really detailed records on each individual variety that you're stewarding is really important. So I don't know, Frank, have you ever done much work with isolation by timing?
Yeah, when I was doing plant breeding, when I was doing plant breeding as part of my salad growing operation, it was all isolation by time because it was all in one space. But, you know, different salad lots were being planted at different times, and I could make it work out so that the first brassicas were done flowering by time, you know, those later were starting. So, yeah, I've done that too.
Yeah, super helpful. Andrew, you want to?
Yeah, we do a lot of time isolation because we try to grow as much as possible, and I wanted to have a word of caution about some time isolation. We decided that we would grow an overwintering kale, an overwintering cauliflower, a broccoli, arugula, mizuna, like maybe an early bok choy to out compete the mizuna, and then I think we also had Brassica carinata and some Juncea also flowering. So we had Brassica genus flowering from like April through July. Don't ever do that. We created the biggest salad buffet that any flea beetle and brassica seed pod weevil had ever seen, and we had probably 6 generations to the point where we had to hang up in our late plantings for our next season, we had to hang up sheets of sticky tape, like 50-foot long sheets of sticky paper in our greenhouse to keep them from eating our starts, and they were black in 2 days, like billions of bugs. So crop rotation in time is also a good thing. So just be careful.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for that. It's really great when you read these seed to seed. It's like it seems like these ideal solutions, right? But then we have the real, right? We have Andrew over here. Another thing that we utilize, we're actually starting to utilize this in the Sierra foothills, caging for our carrots because we have excessive Queen Anne's lice. So we're experimenting a little bit with doing caging and releasing flies for pollination. We also have teamed up with a beekeeper to put nuke hives into these cages. We can also utilize what we call alternate day caging. We do this with pepper crops. So we can, because peppers are selfers, right? But they're promiscuous selfers. So what we can do is we can have 2 capsicum annum crops, seed crops, within less than 500 feet, and utilize the agribon and the PVC hoops to so the idea of alternate day caging is that you have one that's allowed to be in the open, allowing the bees to freely pollinate, and one that's under the agribon. And then either if you do it every day or every second or third day, you don't necessarily have to be every other day, but every few days you change the agribon from one bed of peppers to the other and allow the second crop to be out in the open. And bees have this wonderful habit of going home each night into the hive and cleaning off every little grain of pollen, and so they start the day fresh. So if you are doing alternate day caging, you want to make sure that you change the agribon either early in the morning before the sunrise or in the evening. There's a question back there.
Is the agribon, is that what you're calling it?
Rime, agribon, garden fleece, and what we use is we use the lightest grade. We also have down here you'll see a link, Redwood Empire Awning. Also. They're a really great company to work with. We're now making these larger sort of pollination protection hoops and getting them to custom make these awnings that go over our hoops that are pollination exclusion tents. And so the material is much more durable than Agribon and Rime. You know, that will only last a season on our farm, but this pollination fabric, if you know stored properly, can be used again and again, you know, up to a decade or more. Yeah, because it excludes the wasps and the various pollinators that come in and out, and it also excludes the pollen. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the labor. Yeah, labor. Yeah. Lori? It's been really successful, actually, but the fact is that we have a really great relationship with a beekeeper that is our neighbor, and so he's responsible for keeping the nuke hive really, you know, up and active and fed and things like that. I am not. I mean, I fancy myself sort of. You know, part-time beekeeper, but keeping tabs on those nuke hives really requires, in our case, you know, because we have so much going on the farm, somebody who's really keeping an eye and tending to that. So we have experimented also with these blue bottlenose flies that you release in there, and so they just like you release them, they do their job, they die in there, and then the pollination happens. Did you have another question over there? No. Okay. Great. Wonderful. That's my son picking turnips. So now we're heading into summer. I do want to ask Andrew to talk just really briefly. I know that Frank will talk more in depth about selection, but I really do think that at the time or just prior to flowering, roguing and selecting at this point is really important, because if you have deleterious traits and plants within that population that you don't want those traits moving forward, you want to take the time just before flowering to pull those plants out before that pollen sort of moves about your population. So I know, Andrew, that you talk just really succinctly about this idea of negative versus positive selection. So if you just want to talk about that just real briefly, it'd be really helpful.
I like to think of selection as a spectrum of like how much work you can put in, and kind of depending on what your goals are, how much work you should put in. So I like to think about it as the two main kinds of mass selection that can be done, which mass selection is just like having an open pollinated population that you rogue out of or pick out of. Negative selection is something that is you just go out there and you just cut down the off types, or you're trying to rogue out the ones that are not quite healthy or something like that. It's like basic, the minimum effort needed to maintain a variety. It may not be enough to maintain a variety depending on the species, but sometimes you just need to make sure there's not off types out there. And unfortunately, a lot of seed companies won't pay anything extra to do just a basic roguing. Some do. Sometimes it's unnecessary if you're getting stock seed from a company that has already been heavily selected. But just think about it as like negative selection is going out there and cutting out the bad plants. Positive selection is something that I call when you're going out and choosing the good plants, or you're doing like a serious, like you want, those are the ones you want. You're not just removing the ones you don't want. So it's kind of like a reverse, even though they kind of blend together at some point if you start selecting heavy either way. But just thinking about like those, I'm going to go out there, this variety is so wonky, or this radish, let's say. Radishes are kind of like really variable at times or can drift easily. Going out there and only planting the ones that are kind of true to type that you really like. So digging them all up, choosing all your favorite half of the population and planting it back out, or your favorite 20% is kind of a positive selection. And that can really help guide a variety into quality pretty quickly, depending on depending on the background genetics. If there's a lot of hidden genes, it can take longer, but it can be really powerful, and you can see changes very quickly, especially if you're selecting for your own farm. You'll notice, like, after a couple years of positive selection, the plants will just be growing like crazy for you, and you'll just be like, what happened? I like to equate it as the plants doing this work is you're helping the plant find a sense of place. And once it finds that sense of place, it really likes it, and it's kind of fun to see.
I love it. I feel like you're sort of talking about courtship in a way, you know? I think I just made him blush, actually.
There's another level of more intensive courtship, which is stock selection, which we talked about a little bit, which is you're actually stewarding a particular selection. You might choose like those plants and try to get them all to flower near each other, or like make sure that, oh, I like those 5 plants at that end of the bed. I'm going to make sure to save those specific 5 plants as my stock selection for replanting, because there's maybe a slightly less red version over there on the other side of the bed. So I'm like statistically getting away from that color. You know, like there's all these play that you can have, and it's really like a big spectrum and flexibility. And the last thing I wanted to talk about as far as before the more in-depth plant breeding is something I've done occasionally, which is very powerful and really underrated, is just choosing a bunch of plants that you like and doing half sibling rows. So like corn's really easy. You choose like 20 ears that you think are really great, and you choose half and you plant them out in rows or in like small beds near each other. So those siblings are kind of like, you can see them all in one row together. And if one of those siblings looked good but ends up having a bunch of recessive genes that you didn't like, you can just not take seeds from that whole line. And that's a way to like kind of guide the population in a kind of mass selection further, faster. And then there's other more like hand pollinating and doing crazy back crosses that are sometimes necessary, but not always. So just think about like the spectrum of how much work you want to put in, because it can really maintain quality or really change something rapidly.
Great. Yeah, and just remembering that we're all plant breeders when we're seed stewards. So obviously we don't really have much control over temperature and humidity. This will be determined by when you're planting, based on when the flowering time is happening. We do a lot of low input organic agriculture. We specifically focus on compost teas. So there are certain compost tea blends that I'm spraying and putting onto our crops during flowering time that are high in phosphorus, that are really allowing for good deep fertility and nice blooms. Another thing that I really wanted to emphasize, and I think that probably all of the panelists will agree, is that good weed maintenance to keep seeds out of your seed lot is like of the highest importance. If we can't illuminate anything other than keeping your seed beds as weed-free as possible, will give you a lot less headache down the road when we talk about, Beth's going to talk about seed cleaning. And because it is almost near impossible to get some of those tiny weed seeds out of your finished seed lot. And many folks from seed companies will oftentimes get these lots that have these seeds in it. Steve, I know you've spent many an hour trying to.
Don't get rid of dairy veg.
Some of the weed seeds are actually illegal, just like the diseases are. So you're selling a 50-pound sack and there's 1% bindweed in it.
Noxious
you can
weed,
get
yeah.
Really in big trouble.
Exactly. So just having really, really good clean fields. Yes.
I just,
Yeah.
just want to say something about the fertility. I've always asked people, what do they do special for their fertility program for seed? And everybody's got different cocktails and bacterial mixes.
Endophytes and
voodoo juice, whatever it is. But one thing that I did know in the years that I was at Seeds of Change, that we were able to conduct a little experiment with phosphorus because the farm manager, Rich Pecoraro, actually told me about several fields that were grown. We were growing pepper seed, and several fields had colloidal rock phosphate put on them, and several others didn't. And we knew exactly which ones did and didn't. And we had about 10 pepper varieties, and we looked at these 10 years later, and the results were absolutely dramatic. Is all the ones that had the colloidal rock were still germing in 90 plus, and all the ones that didn't had already deteriorated considerably below 70%. So maybe it was just, serendipitous, but I don't know, it seems like phosphorus cannot be overstated, its importance in having good seed and also longevity in the seed room.
Yeah, actually, Harold Hoven, who's one of our growers for Sierra Seed Cooperative, he talks a lot about that and the importance of his biodynamic regimes in keeping seed quality and shelf life of seed for a lot longer than most commercial sources. So I think it probably plays into that in some way, shape, or form. Great. Any questions up to this point? We're good? Great. Awesome. So, depending on your scale, staking and trellising can either be something that is really advantageous or just kind of gets in your way, in terms of your harvest. If you're on a smaller scale, having things like, one-bys or T-posts that help keep those heavy seed heads off of the ground, keeps the sort of soil splatter from getting onto those seed pods, which will greatly diminish your potential for seed-borne diseases is important. Also, pruning the lower leaves of the plants, like for lettuce, for instance, we prune about a third of the lower leaves off of our lettuce plants to increase air circulation and to also decrease the amount of soil splatter that will jump up onto those lower leaves and allow diseases to travel up the plant. I don't know if you do that same.
We do stripping of lettuce basically for one particular disease, sclerotinia. If you leave all the leaves on the base of the lettuce plant, you overhead water, you will lose 50% of your plants to sclerotinia. Some years, if it's dry, we can get away with not doing that because it's a huge labor thing.
Huge. And
huge.
And you're bitter for hours afterwards.
And you're, so it's a huge labor issue, and I try to judge based on the year, the weather, whether or not it's necessary. But there's some years when I didn't do it, and I really should have, and I lost a lot of plants for not stripping the lower leaves. Also, the pathologist told me that in the blackleg story, because the infections occur on leaves initially, and the more senescent the leaves are, the more easier it is for the infection to begin. Stripping senescent leaves from your brassicas, from your kale and whatnot, is a good disease control strategy for these things that start off as a leaf spot and then they enter the stem of the plant and infect the whole thing. If you can strip that off, and in fact, this can happen by harvesting the kale leaves, for example, or Swiss chard leaves, and selling them. So when I work with GTF on growing kale, it's actually a great benefit to me to have the crew picking those leaves through the winter time. I hadn't thought about that, but it's actually disease management.
Wonderful. So seed crops do become really unruly, as many of us know, and so sometimes in a small footprint of a space, keeping them staked and trellised is really helpful. They don't really follow the rules very, very well.
I have a question on that, on harvesting. Is there like a fine line between harvesting some of the leaves but harvesting too much so that it would
decrease from the vegetative, the mother plant? So the question is like, how far can you go in terms of how much you can harvest? I mean, I would say maybe harvesting around a third of some of the leaves would be all right. I think if you go any more than that, you're really decreasing from the energy of the mother plant, who can go. Do you have a benchmark of?
Sometimes my plants get just stripped by the gathering together farm crew
The
who
locusts.
are just scrounging for leaves in wintertime, and there'll just be a little tuft of kale leaves on the top of the plant. That probably does reduce my yield. But big plants recover. But big plants recover, and this is actually, when I get into plant breeding, I would have mentioned that by harvesting your plants and seeing the ones that recover from harvest versus the ones that don't, you're actually selecting for vigor.
Pressure,
it's
yeah.
a selection pressure,
Yeah.
and I use it that way. But,
Yeah, great.
But yeah.
So middle of the summer, after flowering, this is the time when you're going to be thinking, if you are planting biennials, this would be the time that you would actually plant those seeds for those brassicas and root crops that you'll be allowing to flower the next spring. So this gives them enough time to size up before that frost, but also doesn't tie up that precious field space for 2 full seasons, just a season and a half. And then we enter into fall, and much of this discussion I'll hand over to Beth after lunch, talking about harvest. But really, just want to touch on a few key points. One thing is the timing of harvest, especially with those of us who do have diversified farms. Really choosing your seed crop that will allow you to have good attention to it at a certain time of the year when it's extremely busy, right? When we're going to market, and many of my growers have had crop failures based on not being able to keep attentive to a dry seeded crop and having it shatter all over the place and get rained on or whatever because they couldn't tend to it. So dry seeded crops such as brassicas, lettuces, basil, millet, those can all fall victim to shattering, to birds. Like I've had finches just marauder of lettuce. They love lettuce seed and basil seed too. They go nuts for basil seed in our area. And so just keeping a really close eye on when that seed is coming ripe. Here is obviously a very gross simplification, but what we see in a lot of these dry seeded crops is that you may have, your initial flowers are down here, and so your seeds are becoming ripe down in this portion of the plant, and they're sort of graduating. And then at the top, especially brassicas, you're still having some fresh flowers when you have finished seed here at the bottom. So you want to find that sort of sweet spot of 2/3 to 3/4 of the seed that's done, and not try and wait for every last little seed to be ready on the stalk. Because if you're waiting for those last few seeds to ripen at the top, you're losing the seeds at the bottom, and it becomes this sort of juggling act. So you have to recognize that there is this sort of sweet spot that you look for. And really, this seed ripening, especially once you cut the water off, can happen really quickly. And so making sure that you're making those rounds almost daily on your farm to really keep tabs on how those seed crops are looking. I have interns on my farm, and each of them kind of get assigned a different seed crop in there. Every day they come, they're taking a look and making sure. And so that's one of the biggest things that, to have in our sort of proverbial toolkit as a seed keeper, is to make those daily rounds of observation. Have that small notebook in your pocket and really be tracking what's going on in the fields. For farmers that integrate both fresh market production and seed production, oftentimes wet seeded crops are more suited to them, because those are crops that you can kind of allow to set on the back burner, so to speak. Things like watermelons, melons, tomatoes, cucumbers. We've let overripe cucumber for seed set in buckets for a couple weeks if we get really sort of months, as Andrew said, if we get slammed, and then just when we have lulls in the workflow, we can jump to those projects when needed. And so those are things like cucumbers, eggplants, watermelons, tomatoes, and Beth will be talking about seed cleaning and seed extraction for those ones. So just really being honest, brutally honest with yourself, and knowing what your life is like in July, August, September, October, and really knowing what you can handle and what you can take on. I've so here's some brassicas on our farm. You can see there sort of the flowering spectrum of them. You're starting to see pods, but obviously you're still seeing a lot of flowers. And then at this point, when the seeds start turning from green to sort of brown, is when I would turn the water off for a brassica seed production. But again, you want to make sure that you're having really mature seeds in the pods before turning the water off. Again, we already kind of nailed this one home. It's just, seed savers and plant breeders. I threw this up there to sort of fancy Frank and really just honor the work he did with Stocky Red Roasters. This is my daughter. We homeschool on the farm, and she, as part of a home study project, is doing OP varietal maintenance on Stocky Red Roaster. And so what she noticed when we do multiple levels of selection on the farm. We are selecting in the field for productivity. We're also selecting out of the bins for fruit type and flavor. And so what she noticed, I obviously utilize the child labor, and which is why we homeschool. And so she's sorting out all these peppers, and she's noticing that maybe a third of them have a slightly different shape than the rest of them. And so she just being sort of a type A, sort of left brain type person, started putting them in a pile. And she said, "Mom, I'm going to make my own variety," And so she set all those ones to the side. And then what we did is we did a little bit of research, and we planted out these progeny rows, which were based on those selections that she'd made. And now we're 3 years into a selection project with that stocky red roaster. And so what she did is she laid out a big tarp, and we put a piece of masking tape at the bottom, from 1 all the way to 10. And these were her phenotypes, or her types of peppers that she was looking for. And then she just went to town. As we harvested them, she would gradate them out. And anything from 8 to 10 we would take for stock seed. Anything from 5 to 7 or 8 we would sell, we would have for commercial seed. And anything that was 5 and under, we would just eat or give to neighbors. So we would sort of eat our edits, as Andrew and Sarah often say. So that's her. She's obviously really proud of her pepper project. And so this just goes to show she just turned 10 yesterday. So this is something that, young children can get involved in, and it really engages them in a really positive way. And I think as seed stewards, just this idea of good OP variety maintenance, it never ends, the selection. It never is like, oh, I got that variety to where it is, and now I can check it off the list. It's like, it doesn't work that way. And so getting young ones involved, I think, is really important, because she is who will inherit this work. And the value of well-maintained, open pollinated seed will never go down in value. It will only increase. And this is kind of why we do this work, right? It's for the children. So there are many field guides. Again, we don't have to go into specifics of nitty-gritties, but OSA has a wonderful collection of publications that you can download for free on their amazing website. There's also seed production guides at eExtension. So there's a link there. You can find that and navigate through the OSA website to find that sort of information. And before I wrap up and entertain a few questions, I'll just talk about, again, this timing of dry seed cleaning. If I can emphasize this, I will. Do not leave seeds on tarps for longer than a few days. Like, what I found is that, we harvested it, we got all the seed onto the tarp or the geotextile landscape fabric, and then life got busy, and we sort of we mentally checked that off of our list and then moved on, and then that seed sat on that tarp and was getting moisture, from the ground, wicking up, or little rodents. Cleaning little mouse poop out of seeds is also incredibly difficult and not very pleasant. And so if you can get it, at least, like here you can see one of my interns is doing a really quick rough thresh and screen, and then we get them put up into Rubbermaid totes, and then we'll do the sort of fine polishing and finish cleaning later when we have a work lull. The 15 to 18 gallon Rubbermaid totes are the best. They sort of stand Frank Morton has the thumbs up. I think we should probably be, as seed stewards, we should probably be sponsored by Rubbermaid.
I've always thought so. I wanted to do a commercial for you.
It did. They haven't responded. I know.
Sterilite ones are not.
No.
They get brittle. Yeah, they get brittle. I know. So the Rubbermaid ones are the way to go. So I know that Frank has really spoken a lot about this geotextile fabric. It's a landscaping cloth that is sort of a poly-spun material, which, unlike a tarp, will wick moisture away from the plant material and not create puddles.
And more importantly for us,
Yep. But you'll really, we always, it takes that whole phrase crunch time to a new level. Like, we are at a certain point in September in crunch time, which is the fact that we can actually thresh crunchy seed material and have it actually, sort of fall off of the seed stalks instead of just have this gummy sort of damp and humid mess that you're trying to stomp on. And so if you can utilize that crunch time to do this quick thresh and screen and get it into a bin that's, somewhat moisture proof, then you can take your time and do the finished screening later.
As a tip on this is really good what you put up there. I find that my crew often, when they're laying things out to dry, they think that they can throw it down and kind of walk on it and stuff, and the seeds will shatter out on the tarp, and it's not a problem because it's shattered out on the tarp. That's not true. When you lay your plants out to windrow on your geotextile fabric, you should be gentle with them and try not to knock the seeds off. Mm-hmm. Because once you knock the seeds off, they're down on the tarp, and that's when the mice get to them. Yeah. And that whole lot that's laying on the tarp, we call that fab fall. And we avoid having to use it because no one wants to clean mouse poop out of seed. It's very unpleasant. And any seed that gets on the tarp, you will have to clean mouse poop out of it. There's no doubt about it. So we do it like that. We get it dry, and then we flip it off onto a plastic tarp to crunch it. But everything that fell off on the fabric, that is its own lot from there on out. And we save it. I find it's less than 10% of the seed most of the time.
Essentially your grade B, right?
Yeah, we save it in case we ever run out of the other stuff, then we'll clean it. But otherwise, we're not going to clean it, and most of the time it ends up in the compost pile. So it's a small thing, but I find that I have to remind people of this all the time. It's like, let the brassica seed stay in its capsule, until you're really ready to thresh it.
Exactly. Great point. Thank you, Frank. See, these are all the things that we don't get in these little books. It's just anecdotal and really, really helpful. There's another downloadable, too. Actually, I don't have the other one up here, but on the OSA website, there's the seed crop record, and then there's also the harvest and handling record. And we have a binder for every year on the farm for each and every seed crop that we do, and every seed crop gets one of these sheets. Again, this will just inform your actions for future generations in knowing, hey, I used this type of screen for this specific, seed crop. Also, you can see there's all kinds of information that you can put on these sheets that then you can track back if you have quality issues. It's, like case in point, the pepper and the colloidal silver, it's something you can trace back maybe 10 years and look at the record and be like, what did we do different? The seed is, holding with really great shelf life, looking back to some of these records. So it's just really important, and I really am grateful for OSA for creating these really user-friendly templates for record keeping. We also do a lot of record keeping on our seed packets for stock seed. We have index cards. I have my never leave my side sort of trusty back pocket notebook that I'm writing maps out and stuff. You can kind of never do enough record keeping when you're doing your seed production. And if anything goes wrong, record it immediately and just really note it in here. So again, we're kind of winding back around to winter, and we're going to revisit this. This is this time when we are setting up contracts for next season. We're doing our germination tests. At CR Seeds, we do in-house germination tests, but for some of our more difficult things, we send out of house to places like Penn State. Herbs and things that I don't want to deal with, like dormancy issues or things like that. We can just sort of outsource that. Getting seeds into good storage is another thing, just making sure that you're getting them into a place that's set up for long-term storage. And then I'll just talk briefly about managing biennials for overwintering. Okay. This is, these are some of the crops you can use. This is called root to seed method. So despite 2 seasons in the field, many of our growers, we have one in specific at CR Seeds who really loves doing the root to seed method because it allows him to create a lot of flexibility and integration. So these are stecklings. So when you pull the roots out of the ground, you have your carrots. Again, this pulled from the OSA website. This is some evaluations that probably John did. And you can see, obviously, that if you don't pull up and do evaluations, you can be having some really ugly things happen under the... Yeah, exactly. So you want to make sure that you're getting your eyes on this. And when you do biennials, many of them require vernalization to initiate that flowering. So that's 8 to 10 weeks at less than 50 degrees with a really high humidity, 85%. You can get away with maybe 50 to 80, but that's the best. Here's some carrots that are going to flower. So you select the roots and you put them into storage bins. Again, you want to put many more roots in those bins than you think you're going to need for your population, because we get what we call self-juicing carrots in storage. Things that just kind of degenerate in storage, and so that is also another form of selection for storage ability. You want to dig up the roots of the plants before the temps go into the teens. So if you have a good stretch of 20-degree weather in the fall, pulling them up, cutting off all the leaves, being careful not to cut into the meristems, and then binning them up into a moist sawdust or peat. You can also use sand. We also pot up fibrous plants like cabbage, kale, things like that if you are in a place that you can't overwinter those very easily, and put them into a root cellar. And then plant them again in the following spring. Here's some picture of some beet root selection. And there's beets initiating into flowering, and then a almost finished beet seed crop there being harvested. And I think we're getting kind of sort of close to ending time, so maybe during our seed cleaning we can talk a little bit about seed drying and getting those seeds into adequate seed storage. So if there's any questions on these sort of things, I'll entertain a few, or our panel. So he's asking sort of what percentage or sort of benchmark are we using for selection and to maintain a healthy seed population. I don't know if, Frank, you want to talk about that? How much variability you're allowing for?
It depends on what the crop is. So in something like lettuce, you're not allowing much variability at all because people don't expect that. They expect every head of lettuce to look pretty much alike. So, and it's a selfer.
Exactly.
So you can select a selfer very tight without causing inbreeding depression. In something like, let's just say kale, I would allow more variability there because basically kale is harvested as a bunch and, looks like kale, right? So a little bit of variation from one plant to the next kind of mixes in, and it's not, and also because kale is an outcrosser, you don't want to select it too tight, that is, be too restrictive on what you're keeping, because you'll lead it into a loss of vigor and inbreeding depression. And something like kale that has to keep producing and producing and producing, you need vigor. That's your most important trait. Remember that vigor is also a trait. So the leaf shape is not nearly as important as the kale being vigorous. So it has, this is one of those it depends kind of things. If you're talking about radish roots, right, you want your radish roots to pretty much all look the same, right? So whereas in salad greens, I think you have more flexibility, and my salad greens are often intentionally variable so that the salad looks more mixed up. So I don't worry about my mustard greens all being perfectly the same, but I would worry about, I want my peppers to be pretty right on. I want my, the carrots all have to be the same shape and color and same kind of point on them and all that. So it depends. It depends.
And I think it's important to kind of rate the importance of the different traits. Like some traits are clearly vanity traits. I mean, I know lettuce. Lettuce is one of those crops you want it to look good, of course. But if he loses vigor on his lettuce, that's not good. Like having vigor is kind of pretty important. And I always thought taste was a pretty important thing, but not always.
Yeah.
And it really depends on the market and the demand. What are the traits that your customers are demanding?
And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the afternoon. We talk about breeding. So we're going to wrap this session up because I know you guys are probably hungry, and I hear some sort of talking outside and everybody gathering. But we'll gather together here again at 2 o'clock, and then we'll have Beth come up and talk about seed cleaning and seed harvesting, and then have a bunch of other interesting and exciting topics. So thank you guys for being here.